Richard, I did want to say that about time, it's not the question of punctuality, it's a question of what you do with your time, how you use your time. We're all creatures of what we did with our times in the past since we were born, the choices that we made, and the way we spend time, and we will be what we will be the way we choose to spend the time in future. Richard is principal and co-head of Insight and Foresight at Kinetic Cafe. This is a strategic innovation firm and a startup accelerator in Toronto. He's engaged in futures research, applied foresight practices, in addition to customer insights, organizational design, and transformation work. For the last 15 years, he was co-head of strategic foresight at Idea Couture, which is again a strategic innovation and experience design firm. He co-developed and operated an applied foresight department out there. He also works frequently with startups and commercialization offices at a number of Canadian universities in areas of strategic visioning and pre-competitive intellectual property expansion. Richard is a kind of a gem that I had to really fish very hard for, because I didn't want somebody in Toronto to speak on empathy mapping, and surprisingly I couldn't find anybody, and finally I found one, and I'm very delighted to have him. And essentially he's going to spend time to talk about empathy mapping and the design aspects to discover opportunities. He has some wonderful experiences in Denmark and Turkey, which he will share with us. Please spend time to fill feedback forms before you go for dinner. Listen carefully and develop a call to action. Thank you very much.
Hi, can everybody hear me? Yeah. Thanks so much for the talk. It was awesome. Really enjoyed it. Some cool stuff in there. If you find anybody who does this as well, let me know, because I'm kind of looking to. The structure of the talk tonight is really loose. I tried to gather as many kind of examples of this as possible from my past work. I've had the task of doing a lot of experience mapping, and I guess empathy mapping, or like emotive or affective mapping, was like kind of a component or a dimension of that. If you Google it, you're going to find a lot of like really kind of funny diagrams with like a cartoon head in the center and like think, feel, do, that kind of stuff, where people are just asking questions within these like certain dimensions around what are you doing physically, what happens to you emotionally, what are you thinking while those things are happening, and that's all really good, and that is like a nice generalized form of doing it. But when you apply that stuff, I guess when you're working on project work for really large organizations, or even when you're helping startups do things, and consulting with them, it becomes a lot more hairy. There's every problem, every organization is different, and everybody's service or product is different. So you kind of have to create tools on the fly. So most of this talk is you're going to see a lot of like weird diagrams and a lot of like unconventional maps and stuff. And those are just a function of the work itself, and like the questions that were asked and the things that were told to me. So we kind of drew as we saw, which is almost kind of a new form of like life drawing for me. To give you a little bit of background. I come from like an art and design background. I moved to Toronto to study to be a painter, and then fell into OCAD, not wanting to take painting because I couldn't paint, but I believed, which later I discovered.
Able to help you with that.
Yeah, no. And then so I took industrial design because I wanted to be, I wanted to challenge myself, and then I fell into the hands of Alexander Menu, who you may or may not know, and what an interesting fellow, and his teaching and stuff changed my life. But yeah, I went to OCAD. You mentioned I worked at Idea Couture. Sorry, I just want to do a little bit of a shameless plug. I don't usually do these things, but I'm really passionate about where I am right now. And right now I'm at a place called Kinetic Cafe. It's a startup accelerator and fee-for-service consulting firm. And we have like a crazy digital labs where we have some really interesting dudes that can make like anything. We've got a great roster of people that started some really awesome startups in Toronto and in Canada. I assure you, just check out the website, it's pretty cool. We worked with a lot of really interesting people in our first year, which is like pretty nuts. And we have a great startup program. If any of you guys are starting anything in the food space, please come tell us what you're doing, and you may like qualify for inclusion into our startup program. just to kind of get into empathy, as soon as I got this project, I kind of like Googled it myself and took a plug out, and it kind of matches with some of the things that I've kind of felt or experienced in my own work itself, which is really what you're trying to do is genuinely caring about people, I guess, and really listening to when they talk to you about things. Most of the problems that we faced as like consultants for really large organizations, or like I said, for smaller ones, came from usually a dry or like a not compelling product offering or service offering that was either broken or really needed to be infused with some sort of like human element. To do that, you kind of really got to go out and talk to people, experience their emotions if that's possible. It kind of is. Like when you start to talk to people, I've had a few projects where I've like walked away, especially in the health space where you're talking to patients, where you just yourself get really impressed because you're like, you get a really interesting high resolution window into somebody's like reality, and you're kind of like, in a sense, kind of feeling what they're feeling. And it's like it's a really interesting thing. It's kind of transformative in a way. Another thing is that knowing, I like this idea here at the end, which is new to me, which is like blurring the line between the self and the other. That was kind of like, that's just something that happens naturally if you're doing it right. And if you have people you care about, you know what that's like. So there's a lot of things also, it's not just people. This is a beluga whale. This is probably my favorite like, video on the internet right now. Aside from the thing that you saw in the beginning, which is like the empathetic rats, which just figured out science has told us that rats too are empathetic. But it's a mariachi band playing for like a beluga whale. If you watch this video, the beluga whale's so down with it. It's actually kind of a really interesting thing. But these guys are kind of like practicing some sort of empathy too. I'm sure they all want a question to see if like, can whales dance? Yes. Yes, whales can. But they're also kind of being like, let's go see if this actually happens and see the connection can be made. And it turned out to be a really interesting thing. Also, there's a lot of artifacts too. I try to put this in as well. Like, it really comes down to this like saying, I don't know if you own an Outcast album or whatever, like you probably heard this saying, I feel you. It's really about like being sympathetic with people and like embodying and enacting what's going on. So sometimes when you're working on a project and you're working around a product, you buy it, you use it. I had a great professor once who wrote a book called Sketching User Experiences, and he interviewed Kevin Kelly for it, I believe. And Kevin Kelly was like, we designed this awesome, this awesome laptop. It was like the first laptop. It was like 1980, and had a little space where like, if you put your pen in and you closed it, it wouldn't jam. It would like roll out. Had all these like cool little features and functions that physically were kind of genius until you started to use the project and like or the product and get into the user interface, and that's when he developed like UI or UI design. Him and his crew at Xerox. So that was like, it's really about like getting in, using the things, having conversations, designing your questions to be revealing and to be really like inclusive. Another big piece is reciprocity. This is a place I visited in San Francisco. It's called, I think it's called 826 or 862 Valencia. It's McSweeney's kind of flagship community outreach literacy center for children, where like they can come in, they bring in a school, like they sit down. They ask these kids stories. There's a woman there who's like a writer, so she's asking these kids questions like, okay, well, we're going to write a story today. Tell me about, tell me about the kind of story you want to write. So they'll say like this kind of subject. Okay, what happens in that world? And then so she's like writing in real time. There's a person, a cartoonist, that's like drawing the cartoons for it. And at the end, they make this thing. But there's this kind of virtuous cycle that happens. That really like it's a wonderful thing to watch. But it really does kind of give like a. They're giving the kids something. The kids are giving them something, and it's like a really authentic kind of like. Reciprocal relationship, which is something that is good to do. A lot of the things that we inherited reminded me of this kind of thing. It's a UAV drone. I just kind of came up with that saying today, like cold for culture. Like I think it kind of is indicative of kind of the things that we like send out into the world, the interfaces, like the products, the services that we kind of like let loose. Sometimes they're not always considerate of the human dimension. And this thing is kind of also indicative of like some of the things that have been coming out in terms of, I watch publications sometimes just to see where like the social imagination is. And this is maybe kind of, it's an interesting thing to see, like, they've got some like Dexter case study on the corner there, and then there's like a whole like kind of handbook of corporate empathy, like it can be kind of like learned or degraded into like internal processes. There's some things that are kind of truths for me that you'd be surprised that you kind of have to keep telling people that there are really no like users, like we hear that a lot. You also hear things like consumers or customers. It really is kind of transactional and kind of like detached. So I like to think about, people are like collections of motivations, of cultures, of like interests, beliefs, and conventions and things. And if you're not really aligned, or if your products are misaligned with those kind of things, or if they don't take them into account, then they're not going to fly. They're not going to be compelling. It's not like a differentiated, amazing service offering. It's going to be kind of like a cold interface. These pictures too are just like kind of portraits of. I kind of love this series. Portraits of people and all their belongings and what they feel is valuable. It's kind of a fresh thing. You can check it out on the web. It's not like there's a ton of them. They're beautiful. And this idea of like values and value, and that there's like a coterminous relationship there too. So just so when you're thinking about doing these sort of things, I'm going to show you in the next few slides after one story about like maybe how these things are done. Because we could talk about empathy for a long time and consumer-centric design, which also I'd like to say there is no such thing as I think with like a consumer or human-centered design. All design is like human-centered, like it really should be, and that's that. One way I'd like to express this is this place I visited in Copenhagen. When I was there doing a bunch of food research, we fell on this. I have this actually awesome girl who's like my contact there. We have like this crazy global network of kids that feed us kind of like intel and signals and things all the time for our like foresight scanning network. But she's our lady in Copenhagen, and she introduced me to this wonderful woman from this elder care facility. They don't have like old folks homes; they have elder care facilities, which is kind of an interesting small deviation as well. This is the lady we met. Fantastic woman. Had fresh strawberries and beautiful like drinks and things for us when we got there. And she just told us the fundamental difference between this place and an elder care facility, which is essentially that like it's in a home, it's in a residential home. And this is kind of a story too about the woman who started this was put her own mother in an old age home, and she noticed that the place was just really cold and it was a bad place. She's like, can I design this thing better? And her last name is Lot, so if you wanted to Google that, just check her out. She speaks all over the world and has like a really interesting framework for changing this kind of elder care space. But they do things like somebody comes in and cuts all the ladies' hair like every couple weeks, because even if you're an elderly person, you still want to look good, you still want to have your hair cut. It's kind of a fresh thing. This lady was kind of, let me take a picture of her getting her hair cut. She was actually pretty cool. They let people smoke, they let people have sex, they let people have relationships. If you have anxiety problems, or you're dementia or something, and you want to go to the store, they don't like send somebody out, or like they don't strap you down, they don't give you a helmet and like tell you to go off in the way. And somebody watches them. They just want to give people autonomy kind of thing. So the design of that system is actually really cool, and it kind of sounds funny at times, but it really comes down to like an empathetic consideration of like letting people be people and like not treating them as if they're users or consumers or like a number within like an elder care system. They let them have like amazing belongings, like their real life belongings. There's also lineups like crazy to get into this place. You can't pay this woman enough to come and speak. Like people want to franchise this thing all the hell. It's actually a really cool model. I saw this puppy on the couch. I thought it was pretty cool. You turn the puppy over, it's like this weird startup. It's like a robotic, it's a compassion or like an empathy robotic, which is really interesting. The people there kind of love it too. They have like an interesting relationship with it. That's whole compassion robotics and are something that came out of Japan because there's not enough people in the tertiary service industry. But that's kind of bleeding out all over the place. This is one interesting story from that place as well. It's situated right beside a children's school, and what they wanted to do when they made it like an elder care home, they wanted to put up a wall between the children and the elder care facility. And they told them, no, we don't want it. And they're like, but these kids are going to be kicking balls all over the place. It's going to come through the window. And the lady was like, we want to have a relationship with them, so there's some sort of intergenerational exchange. And like it really did bring up, people are like libraries on fire. They want to tell stories, kids love stories. There's like a really interesting relationship that has evolved between those two generations within this context that is kind of like remarkable. And in 20 years that they've been open, only one soccer ball came through the window, and everybody clapped. But really, when you're doing these sort of things, or you're doing this empathy mapping, it's all about like getting into this like spectrum of subjectivities, which I like to call it. Kind of sounds nerdy, but really it's kind of what it is. It's like there's multiple people here that we're talking about, not just the people that are giving us the brief in this boardroom or these kids that are starting this startup. It's like there are people that are going to be involved, the customers or the people. And there's going to be their friends, their parents, their like everything that surrounds them. There's the people that work within the system or the service, or like the people that are making the stuff. So you try to speak to everybody and really map it out. It's like a full spectrum kind of way. And the big thing here is to really immerse yourself in these like people, their perspectives, the paths that they take, the roles and relationships that are happening within this either product offering or service offering, and really getting a sense of the spaces and places all this stuff occurs. So really getting in there. And this is kind of a map that my colleague Sadie drew, which is pretty awesome. It was for like a healthcare project or something. But he was like going through, he got there, he entered, he talks to somebody too, he's getting kind of guided through. And with each like kind of vertices here, there's like a task that needs to be done, and you can see how complex one person, like how many like wings and stuff that they have to access to get their job done, and it's like a really huge process. Can this be streamlined, or are there efficiencies that need to be had? It's kind of a really interesting way to like, get a sense of like what people have to go through, and all the while kind of hearing their stories about how that stuff is playing out. One thing that I'd like to say, which is even before all these things, none of the things that I'm doing here are really like, they work for the project and they'll work for other projects, components of them, but really you kind of have to be like ballsy and like, man as a tool maker will make, or game maker, things like that, make your own game, make your own tools. Don't be like, kind of have a fearless like thirst for like making your own mapping or your own mapping forms, because that's what's really going to work. And let the project kind of like let the information guide you, because that's like, and the conversations and the answers people have, because if you listen well enough, they'll tell you some pretty remarkable things. One guy who was like this was this fellow John Cage. If there's anybody who's into music in this room, you'll recognize this man with the apple on his head and the weird like thing around his. He wrote a book called Notations, which came in a re-release that has some really interesting interpretations of songs and of canons by different artists that like kind of show through really listening to the music how it kind of could be visualized. Just weird kind of stuff like this. So this stuff was inspiring to me because I was like, okay, here's a guy who's respected by everybody who just kind of like didn't go by a 1, 2, 3, or 4 kind of like a methodology and kind of made up his own tools. And I think that's really, really valuable. Not enough people like give you the confidence to like go out into the world and have the balls enough to really do that. So we do. And we try to think about the thing as like a system in a sense. There's agents, there's environments, there's exchanges and dynamics, rhythms, rituals, and rules. And it's really about getting out there and diving in and like and trying to surface all those things and get them onto paper and develop a common language through conversation and things like that. And I believe that like sketching these kind of maps out for me has worked personally as like a shared language with people, because you sit down, you walk through a service to somebody, or you engage with a product with somebody, or maybe you're doing like an internal like organizational transformation project, but they want to build out a new service line and like they have goals around that, but they have to speak to like the stakeholders are all internal and they may be from multiple geographies, but you get some sort of a map together and you really start to, there's one project I did, a huge organizational transformation project with a company that's not too many buildings over from here, that they didn't even, and they're a huge company that you would expect would have like at least an org chart, and they didn't have it. Like, so we had to through like many conversations with many of their like partners and firms, like build out like a real like what does the trust network look like? How does the money flow? How is this organization structured really? And it took us like a long time to get to that so that we could actually do a real job. It came from an original email being like, can you just send us your org chart? And it was kind of really interesting. So it's really through these kind of conversations and notational forms that you kind of like start to surface things and start to notice little overlaps, fissures, broken pieces, and start to design around them. And those are really where you start to identify the opportunities. One place here, this is an interesting story from Copenhagen. Are these stories okay? Or are they kind of revealing? Okay, cool. I was wondering if you actually enjoy them and if it's they're informative. So I do this a lot when I travel for work. Sure, we sit in boardrooms, we do this kind of stuff, but really, like I said, I'm trying to get out in the world and like see what's going on. So I'm working with a big like food company at the time, so I'm interested in what's kind of going on in the street. We walked down, and I found these posters all the way. It was like out of the camps, and I didn't really know, but there's like in Denmark, there's a lot of camps that these people call like New Dance clans, like New Dance, like the New Danes. They're like all kind of waiting to have to be kind of included into Denmark as citizens. And some of them are just waiting or being held to go to other geographies or other places as asylum seekers. And it was really interesting. These people are like, they want to get these people out of the camps, like the Danes themselves want to get these people out of the camps to become a little bit more integrated in society and live and work outside of them. But it's a hard thing. It's a huge point of like political kind of conversation in Denmark, especially for people that are like all our age. So there's a group of chefs and a group of policy people. There's like, I believe it was the Harvard Stroke Foundation too, or no, it was the Danish Red Cross. everybody got together to create something like they were calling like a tangible provocation or some sort of like a dialogical design around how can we get something in the hands of everybody so that something that you can engage with and ingest that like allows you to like talk about this thing in like a little bit more informed manner. What I would say is like another empathy device. It doesn't solve the problem. It's not like a piece of policy or it didn't really cause a lot of change. What it did do is get a lot of people talking. And these were essentially, they're called new danskvand, which is like new Danish water, which is a soft drink that's carbonated, that's like a pop, that's flavored by the spices and flavors that are found in the countries that the asylum seekers are trying to, that are leaving, which is kind of really interesting. So there's stuff like, I think one of them was I actually forget what the countries were, I don't want to give wrong information, but there's like one of like salty and spicy, which is something that you would find more in like a Middle Eastern context. There's really kind of an interesting piece of design. And then you could find it in any convenience store. You could find it at some like hot dog stands and things like that. It became like a pretty cool thing. And the only reason they were able to make it is because they were reaching out to people in the asylum to co-create it, and they were using kids like these two chefs in the corner that you can't really see that well that are actually like from the places that they were talking about and could kind of pull on their like cultural intel and do something that was ultimately interesting, and then do some interesting testing with people to see if they felt as if it was if it aligned with their tastes within that region. Because sometimes you'll have something like a salty hot drink that you would find in like a meat-based drink, something you would normally find in a place like Istanbul, and you're like, this is really weird. This was something that they could say it's like a middle ground, but it gets like the point across, but it also has like good taste. So it was like almost like dual empathy kind of thing. Design research. One thing that kind of really stood out for me in this sense, when we're talking about these sort of things to really immerse or enact yourself in these kind of situations, is this idea of design improvisation. This was written by Brenda Laurel, who is like the editor for this book. It's an MIT Press book. If you're into this like kind of this space of design research, I would suggest maybe buying it. It's not a Bible, but it's like a collection of texts that are kind of useful if you're looking to learn. And one thing that stood out for me in the whole book, there's a lot of great stuff on qualitative and quantitative analysis, but one was this idea of like performative ethnography, which is literally the idea of doing, asking these kind of questions, getting at the heart of the matter, but then also enacting it or like doing the process yourself. And while you're doing it, kind of working out the physical components, but then also talking through like all the things that the person was telling you, like all the insights that you come to, the overlaps that you hear from like multiple stakeholders while you're doing these interviews or doing these like immersions. Kind of speaking about that while you're enacting this thing. It's a really interesting way to like kind of get in there and get your hands dirty and get into the world. It's also a really interesting way to present your work in a context that's like a boardroom where you'll actually look like you're dancing to like no music, but it is kind of compelling because the setup is the music itself, like saying the context. Normally to map these kind of processes or to map like a service, I do these kind of things often. My book is kind of full of these. I don't really show this stuff to a lot of people either, so this is actually interesting for me. But so I'll do these kind of like journey or storyboards or like little maps with a lot of annotations that are like kind of pointing out to me what all the salient pieces are, so I can remember really like what's going on because the book gets kind of full fast. But this is just kind of like the physical component, like where are they, what do they have, what are they doing, that kind of thing. I'm not going to get into like really big specifics. This is another form, but it's very, very different because it's just, instead of doing something that's representational where you have things like people and vans and products and things like that, it's just kind of like nodes within geography. So you can do it geographically, you can do it like here with those kind of cues, or you can do it in this sense too, which is a little bit more of a manifold thing. So this would be everybody I was talking to, so all the stakeholders up and down the chain, all of their perspectives. And here you start to really understand where the breaks or the fissures in the system, where people get frustrated, and where the design interventions can happen, like where the opportunities can be identified. And they're usually in places where there's like where things bifurcate or trifurcate or like kind of spin off into like horrible side or subroutines that are like usually very time consuming, where people, I guess the saying is something like fall between the cracks or something like that. This is, I believe, like a patient journey that my colleague Sept did. It's a really, really rough sketch, and he's still kind of working out how the end map notebook, nothing like this, but for him, this was like an initial way to be like, okay, they're going here. they get sent over to this other kind of department, and then they get spun into a whole other bureaucratic thing, and then you start to talk to them that go through this process, and then they start to get really stressed out. Some of them are like really fearful because it's like if it's a health-oriented type thing, it gets to be like really hairy. And then you have a cascading effect through all of their friends and family that are also indirectly but directly part of that experience. And then that spills into the actual caregivers that have to like develop the skin or do and talk. It's really kind of an interesting, really complex kind of thing. But this gets everything onto one page so that everybody can have a discussion and start to identify like what can be done. If we're going to say stop and fix this problem right here because there's too much things happening or spinning out of this, is it even within the power of the people in the room that we're talking to be able to do that? Is it a much more entrenched problem? How can we like build a roadmap out to phase in a series of interventions and inclusion from other people within the organization to do something about it? But it really comes down to this idea of mapping out the flows and understanding the feelings, and then starting to get to work. Another way, I guess, to map this kind of this emotional piece, we did this one, which is really interesting. It's for like a funeral. You break it into like phases, but they really wanted to, it's a really emotional time. People were, there's this very little relief and a lot of grief. It's very expensive. It's a horrible time. But then you get to this idea where like everybody in the system wants to feel more relieved and feel less grief. And this is after interviewing people that are involved in the actual business of it, the people that deliver the service, and the people that have to go through the service. And it's interesting the overlaps that happen, but everybody kind of wanted the same thing. So then you at least be able to, like you're talking about, it's a goal setting kind of thing. Where like now we know our goal, which seems really simple, release, decrease the amount of grief and release, or, increase the amount of relief. And it's a lot harder when you actually get going through like that episodic kind of process of mapping the actual experience and like the actual products that are offered. And you end up in the end with a very different business and a very different business model and a whole different set of offerings. One way we started to map this, because you haven't really seen any emotional mapping yet, you've kind of just seen a lot of like structural mapping or like experience mapping. This is where you start to overlay like different emotions. And so you have that top track that is like the do track. That's what people are engaging with, what's happening, where they are, and what they're doing. But then underneath, you start to, through all these interviews, and you do like a whole bunch, and then from all of them you start to see some overlaps in how people generally feel. It's general, but sometimes there is like a reigning outcome that comes from certain kinds of services where you can really make a good recommendation that you're comfortable with. But this is just a very loose, rough sketch in the beginning, because you're like, okay, we have this other form of mapping. We can start to overlay on this other, how are people feeling along the course of that, experience. Okay. So then you start to get a little bit more granular about it and create like a matrix of emotions where you can start to extract these sort of things from the text that you're getting or from the interviews that we're making, which is pretty cool. So then you start to say, okay, I have these things, I can start to do them. And I can reduce my spectrum to a smaller spectrum that's a little bit easier to grasp from the kind of text, and then start to overlay that. And also the intensity of it too. You can have 0, which is maybe like your Dexter line of like sociopath that feels nothing, and then you have stuff that's maybe a little bit negative below, and then positive. It's not science, but but you can definitely see in people's faces and like the inflections in their voices, the intensity of the emotion that they have felt when they're recalling kind of certain situations. And then it ends up being something like this in the end, where you really have like a high granular look. Each of these things are then mapped to like a series of all of the interviews, and you get a high like resolution look at like this is what people are doing, thinking, and feeling during this like experience. And then you can start to say, these ones are super intense. These are places where somebody may be feeling like super stressful during the course of this whole experience. They feel fear a couple times. And then at the end, they're feeling like this, like a lot of apprehension about either continuing or something. And then they're thrown out of the service and then offsite to another place where they're even more intense about like other things. So like you know that there are problems here. For one thing, why is there like a separation? Why are we? What are we doing down here that is like causing this like cascading feeling of negative effects? And what can we what can we alter or like tailor to like make people feel different all the way through the whole system? Is it a redesign of the product? Is it like where this thing occurs? Is it the length of time that the service occurs? I don't know. There's a number of interventions that you can make, but at least when you have a map like this, you can start to like have an informed discussion and make some real changes. And then you go do another deep dive, which is basically like you find the point where it's like the craziest, like this point of either that high stress or that moment here where people are like apprehensive or fearful. And then you go back and you talk to those people and you start to like unpack or like decode a little bit more about like what you can do at that point. So we usually will go back in and do more interviews or have more discussions and conversations about things so you can really get to the heart of it. And then usually you can find you can make like prototypes or little probes that like you can reintroduce to people and like have some sort of stimulus for them to react to say like if it were like this, is this a good aspirational model for us? There's a lot of ways people are attacking this too. It's not just like nerdy kids running around with sketchbooks like me. And sometimes they try to make like affective computing is like a real thing. It's been like around since I think like the 70s, ever since they had those crazy galvanic sting response sort of things that you can say when you're sweaty or nervous and stuff. But this is in a small research university town called Wageningen in Copenhagen, and it's like a food sciences research center, and they're usually testing how like taste, flavor, mouthfeel of like new food products or consumer packaged goods. And this is my friend Andrew. He's sitting in the chair. Usually he'd be like kind of you eat something. And then they would use this webcam to analyze with a bunch of algorithms, like with what's the spectrum of emotions that he's feeling at that time, based on his on a few different cues. One for would be galvanic skin response, and a lot of them are just software enabled that exists within the machine vision framework that we're running. So you can see there's little graphs and interesting things that give people cues, or you can say this thing tastes bad or tastes good or what have you. Usually after, so that's like another form of that is being done, which is actually kind of really interesting. After we do all these sort of things, then we usually do like a lot of scenario planning and ideal experience mapping, which looks something like this, where you really kind of roll through a scenario, what should happen, what could happen, what people will like engage with, and they usually look like, I usually have them on like a long time-based scroll and try to like not kill people by death by PowerPoint. Usually scrolls are a lot more fun for people to like gather around like a campfire and like engage with and walk around and pen up and it's an interesting way to deliver content. Different shots of them. Another way to do it would be to actually like, if you're going to create, little pilots and probes and prototypes. I usually call these kind of sorta types because they're not really prototypes. They don't work. They're kind of just there to get an idea across. And I would usually like walk through and be like, this is an aid for how to feed a baby over the course of like the first year of their life, according to like how do you portion things out, what temperature should it be. Do I stick the fork in? Does the fork turn red if it's bad? Am I allergic to those things? Or does the fork turn green? Be like, this is a good thing to feed my baby. And this is how much I should be feeding it, things like that. Stuff that you like could learn from your mother, but might get taught to you by a spoon or a bowl. The last thing I'm going to say is like a story of a social entrepreneurship story, which is really kind of took me aside when I was in Copenhagen as well. I kind of promised a story from Turkey, but I took it out because it wasn't really that compelling. So this is the last one I'm going to tell, and then I'm done. But yeah, these guys are called BB. They run like well, you guys must have all heard, we had like the craziest bead, I guess, scene in Toronto. There's a lot of scientists gathered here to like talk about that issue. It's accelerated in the last few years, and it's like complete colonies are dying, things like that. And these guys are trying to do good for the environment in terms of spreading like the amount of knowledge and like literacy about this problem, but also getting people involved and engaged in like in beekeeping. For everybody from like schools to convicts, like school children to convicts, and I'll tell you about that. There's a lot of people that come in that are like from different nations or are marginalized people. There's a lot of racism there, and you see it. It's really kind of interesting, and a lot of people aren't getting hired when they come out of jail and things like that. It's a common problem everywhere. But here, like you have the option of working for this kind of a company where there's or if you're homeless and you don't have a job, this is another place you might turn. But they allow you to come in. You see these little tiny boxes over here. So if you're new, you come in. They take a queen out. They put it in a tiny like sex box for for bees, and then they get it on. It's all cool, and then they eventually graduate to like a larger box, which is like a hive. And those things are staffable. So this guy's created some really cool IP around these like hives and how they're deployed and how he involves people in them. After you're able to harvest your honey as like a marginalized person or what have you, and you're able to sell it in the tons of food fairs because the food scene there is just really big. So you can see how a lot of their solutions for a lot of their social problems are food-based, because there is actually like a mandate from the country to do like food as a food economy happening. But anyway, it's really, really interesting, and all these wonderful things come out of this, aside from people being empowered and are able to like interact with like some really interesting things and get like, I guess, socialized back into a good society. They get to become a provider, like a smallholder provider of a resource, which is really sweet, like honey. And one thing they noticed was that every box says around different flowers, and every honey is like has a different unique flavor, which is also awesome because all the honey that we drink are all. Am I the only one that drinks honey? All the honey that we eat is like is all thrown into one big vat and like mixed up, and it's kind of like horrible what they do to honey, I think. But these guys are really awesome. They have like a really, really cool business. I suggest you like check them out. If you're ever in Denmark, go visit their farms, and the entomologist that works there is more than happy to like to talk about his thing. But that's me chilling out, getting some honey. Thank you. That was fun. Does anybody have any questions?
I do.
Yeah.
Awesome. May I call you Richard?
Yeah, you may.
Awesome. Thank you, Richard. That was great. I have one comment and one question.
Yeah.
The comment is, I found it absolutely daunting that you were able to do all those drawings in pen, on paper, and in color.
Yeah.
I thought that was I'd be terrified of doing that. So that was my comment. But my question is, how do you...
Pay me to do it. I'll come do it for you.
Well,
I'm just joking after.
well, at least if helping, well, so, which is a good segue to the question. So when you're mapping, actually it's a two-part question. Where's a good place to start? And B, how kind of connecting it back to, I forget your name. Duncan, thank you. Duncan's presentation. How do you not get lost? So as you're mapping, you're assuming, you're making assumptions, right? Because you're visioning and you're doing all your possibilities. How do you avoid drilling down into, yes, possibilities, but they're so already far out there that you've kind of lost your way. And you gotta
they
get
might
back.
look, actually, I'm sorry, I'll let you finish it.
But yeah, no, so that was.
They might look really complex, but they do, it's something like when you start with a painting, or you start with a drawing, or you start with a map, you usually start at the start, and like by the words of, I don't even know who really said it, but like start anywhere. Like usually you'll have, you'll be working either with anthropologists or design researchers. You might be a design researcher yourself. They usually ask you to do these horrible little things called discussion guides, which are really structured ways of like asking questions to receive answers. There's a lot of creative ways that you can approach doing that, but like usually you have a series of questions that you're trying to roll through, right? Like and you things that you're interested about. They're usually they try to are open-ended questions that should hopefully contain some sort of like emotive or effective kind of like information, and a lot of other information about like what they're doing, thinking, feeling, seeing, and that kind of stuff. When you get lost, usually it's not really like because you're overwhelmed by the visual, because you've drawn it. You know what I mean? So you kind of know where you are, and when you get lost or you go on a tangent, it's quite visible. Like you're gonna go like, you're gonna be like, why am I way over here and the rest of my map's way over there? And it's like 4 in the morning and maybe I should get sleep and like that sort of thing. It's the map will tell you, like that key information will tell you, and the tapes will tell you too, because you're usually kind of going back through either video footage or you're lucky enough to have that person in the room. But yeah, it's one of the things where just like listen to your heart. No, I'm kidding. Just like listen to yourself and listen to the map. Listen to yourself. Listen to the map. Anything else?
Oh, sorry, I have one.
Yeah, no, go for it. Shoot.
So I just bought a whiteboard, which I'm really, really excited
Congratulations,
about.
by the way. That's really awesome.
Thank you. I also
Whiteboards are
downloaded
awesome.
a program called Vue, V-U-E.
Yeah.
It's a mapping program
Okay.
that a university made. But what's your favorite method of mapping?
That's my favorite. Hands, I guess, and I like to do paintings as well. Like they look kind of, they look crazier than those. I fill my sketchbooks up. Sketchbooks are my favorite software. Hands are my favorite software. And then if anything, I usually have it all figured out there, and then I'll go into like a program, like some sort of visual authoring program. Like I use Illustrator. It's like really, really easy. If you have something complex enough, you want to screw around with like some time-based things, then you can do like I like 3D Max. So this is really fun. But this is another thing too. Those are what mine looked like. Like yours will look totally different, and you will use the tools that you're comfortable with using, and that's okay. Not everything needs to look like that or look like an emotion map or something. Really, it's about like a way to like notate what's happening, create like a language that's like good for you and the person that you're talking to or the people that you're talking to, and then coming up with good insights and good interventions, because that ends up looking like Starbucks. Like it doesn't end up looking like a map in the end. It's just a deliverable. It's just a conduit. Don't take it too seriously either. That's the other thing. It's like, you know, they can be redrawn. They're disposable, like, as much as a conversation might be.
Richard, the elementary mapping to discover the archetype and persona of a customer
Yeah.
is fairly simple. That does not have to be drawing. It can be answers to questions
Yeah.
or discover a day in life of your customer
Yeah,
to
yeah.
get the insights.
Exactly.
And just so that everybody is not blown away with the complexity, we have Richard and Matthew back here on October 10th, when we will actually do the exercise of value proposition and related to customer segments. So all of you will be doing a workshop and actually doing it, and it doesn't have to be drawing all the way.
A lot of it's like a lot of it's text-based too. Like there's a lot of things where it's just, you know, it's a lot of writing, questions, answers, highlights, overlaps, and then like it doesn't need to be drawn. But because of the mapping element of like the request, I wanted to show you some kind of things I don't usually show a lot of people.
Any more questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I work with the community at St. James Town. Do you do functional mapping for the whole community?
Yeah.
It's a very dense community. It has about 24,000 people living there.
Yeah.
It's 1 square kilometer.
Yeah.
And
I live close by. My best friend lives on Howard Street actually. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Amazing. I think, what, do you work there?
Yes.
Let's chat after. I mean, like, that's really compelling. I think that's kind of cool. Yeah, great. I'm done, so I'm going to let you guys go. Thank you for listening. That's great. Oh, I want to ask one. Can I ask a question?
Yep.
Okay. Did anybody learn anything from that? Because was it informative?
Yeah.
Okay. You don't have to say that, so you can just shut up.
It's like when you see the skyline first time from top,
Yeah.
but when you see it many times, you mean it.
Oh. See you soon, guys.